Mary Borden and the Gender of War. At the outset of the war, Mary Borden was an English missionary's wife and mother to 3 children, the last of whom was born in 1914. Caught up in the fervor of the war's opening days, and perhaps bored by her domestic life, Borden took money she had inherited from her family in Chicago and established a frontline hospital on the French Flanders border. Throughout the war, she worked as a self-trained nurse and hospital administrator, expending a considerable portion of her inheritance and providing essential care for French, Belgian, and British soldiers fighting in the trenches. After the war, she wrote her modernist memoir, The Forbidden Zone. Borden dedicated The Forbidden Zone to the poilus who passed through our hands during the war, because I believe they would recognize the dimmed reality reflected in these pictures. Characterizing her writing as a series of pictures, Borden emphasizes the painting-like quality of the text. Ariella Friedman notes that the argument could easily be made that the dominant aesthetic influences on Borden's work are paintings rather than books. Like a Cubist painter, she portrays a dehumanized and abstracted landscape. Certainly, one couldn't call the book a memoir, or a short story sequence, or a novel, or a prose poem, or any other name that describes a coherent text. John Berger writes that Cubists broke the illusionist three-dimensional space which had existed in painting since the Renaissance. It did not destroy it, it broke its continuity. The Forbidden Zone has a similar aesthetic, breaking the continuity of the war memoir, the nursing memoir, and fictional genres in its quest to represent the Great War accurately, in all its chaos and disjunction. In doing this, it echoes modes of writing that it cannot replicate, calling into question not only pre-war literary modes, but also the social values that informed them. Borden's book deploys modernist strategies of fragmentation, incompletion, and indeterminacy as the most accurate ways to capture the feeling of the war, disrupting readers' expectations of how a war story should play out, and particularly of how a woman should write about war. Rather than displaying feelings of motherly compassion or professional sympathy, Borden's nurses display detached numbness, their own version of shell shock. The Great War offered writers challenges because of their sense that the war itself was unlike anything that had ever happened before. Despite this, war writing settled into remarkably stable forms, or seemed to at least. With the great flowering of war writing in the late 1920s, 1928 and 1929 saw the publication of All Quiet on the Western Front, Undertones of War, Siegfried Sassoon's Schurston books, and Goodbye to All That, among others. A mode of encountering the war gained social and critical acceptance. War stories were to be the stories of frontline soldiers. When non-combatants wrote, their texts must uphold the soldier's tale as the most authentic experience of the war. War memoirs were structurally conservative, narratively coherent if episodic renditions of events that could be located on a calendar and military map. Positive experiences were limited to renditions of comradeship, whether this involved shared pleasure, such as the extra rations meal that Paul and his friends wangle at the beginning of All Quiet, or shared suffering, as in accounts of battle or trench life. Until fairly recently, critics imagined the war memoir through a lens partially created by Paul Fussell's The Great War and Modern Memory. This mode of thought allowed little space for the narratively unusual war book, such as David Jones's In Parenthesis. It allowed even less for books written by women, and the critical history of the Forbidden Zone reflects this. Margaret Higonnet notes that in the 20th century, not only seeing combat, but dying in action have become paradoxical prerequisites to the writing and certification of war poetry. Because women were barred from the ultimate rites of war, they became its symbolic stakes, what war was fought for. But Borden, as Higonnet notes, resists the cultural pressure to conform her story to a pre-made pattern. War and nursing both engage in the struggle at the threshold between life and death, she writes. Because war is so often understood as a question of borderlines, it becomes symbolically identified with other thresholds of initiation, such as sexuality and death. Heroic in the hands of Hemingway and Remarque, these themes in Borden's writing become empty riddles. Like other women writers of war, Mary Borden never forgets that the primary sacrifice of life exacted by war is borne by men. Yet at the same time, I argue, she asserts a reality that is contiguous to, but not identical with, men's experiences on the front line, a reality that observes and codifies their suffering, while also asserting a separate and equally meaningful suffering on the part of nurses who, while non-combatants, were still located in the battle zone. Friedman describes the Forbidden Zone as working at this dangerous edge of representation, saying that Borden's experimental and fragmented vision of the war dramatizes the limitations inherent in the non-combatant's representation of trauma, while it goes beyond representation to iteration by using strategies of dislocation that destabilize the reader. Thus, as with many modernist texts, Borden's book aims not to tell the reader about the events it describes, but rather to create in the reader herself the feelings it records. While Borden's experience of the war is second-hand by one way of reckoning, it is exposed and traumatic enough that it exacts psychological coping strategies and debilities similar to those of combatants. Thus, for Laurie Kaplan, The Forbidden Zone is notable because it emphasizes the inadequacy of language and the ineffective simple-mindedness of the singular form, while it explores the corroding effects of war and challenges assumptions about what is appropriate for the woman writer to take on in terms of form, content, imagery, and realism. Just as canonical war memoirs often feature authorial interjections about the inability of language to truly capture the experiences of the war, Borden's text begins with the claim that the only people who will fully understand the book are those who don't need to read it because they were there. The failure of language, no matter how ingeniously deployed, to express the experience of the war is a prominent theme of her book, one that is highlighted by the experimental forms through which Borden feints at capturing what it was like to be there. Thus, through a combination of experimental form, direct denunciation of her own project, and evocative and startling descriptions of her experiences, Borden represents the war in the mode of Emily Dickinson, tell all the truth but tell it slant. And for similar reason, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Like many war memoirs, notably Edmund Blunden's Undertones of War, The Forbidden Zone does not describe shell shock, but rather enacts it through its oftentimes blank and distanced prose. So, in a sketch like Conspiracy, Borden's sentences passively assert that it is all carefully arranged, and it is arranged that men should be broken and that they should be mended. The text never specifies who does the arranging and for what purpose. Instead, the humans involved, the broken and the menders, are mere objects of the impersonal arrangements of war. Borden compares these objects, the wounded men, to torn and dirty clothes. Just as you send your clothes to the laundry and mend them when they come back, so we send our men to the trenches and mend them when they come back again. This we acts like an automaton, and we send our men to the war again and again, just as long as they will stand it, just until they are dead, and then we throw them into the ground. The slight shifts in the meaning of just in this passage show how carefully constructed the prose is. At first it means in the same way, then for as long as, then merely. But this last time, the merely is merely dead, a juxtaposition of a diminishing qualifier with a concept usually accorded heavy weight, particularly in war writing. The fourth meaning of just, right and proper, is the only one omitted from this passage. Male war memoirists often said, with Sassoon and Owen, that they didn't want to glorify war or death in war, as had so often happened in past war writing. But within their texts, death is still personal and honorable. That is, the person who dies is seen as connected to other soldiers. His suffering, no matter how pointless, is ennobling. But Borden's blank affect and passive sentences emphasize the machinery of war, the interchangeableness of soldiers who are not individuals or even members of regiments or battalions, but simply pieces of laundry, tagged and sent to be fixed up or discarded. The metaphor suggests, too, that they are dirty laundry as they go up to the front, not the noble innocence or heroic sacrifices that earlier war poetry would suggest. The step back that Borden must take because her gender prevents her from standing in the firing line, even though she is at the front, allows this broader view that depersonalizes suffering and death, even as it fervently rejects narratives of heroism and meaningful sacrifice. These men do not have names or even numbers. Borden's narrative conveys the war's horror by stripping them of their humanity. But the observing narrator is also stripped of humanity, in that she operates like an automaton, mechanically acting in the same way over and over, despite the irrationality and pointlessness of her actions. In this way, Borden reflects the view of war expressed in trench songs, such as We're Here Because We're Here, an ode to the existential dilemma at the end of the war to end all war. In doing so, Borden reflects the reality of working in a frontline hospital. Men arrive at the hospital anonymous, classified there by their injury, abdominal wounds to the abdomen ward, head injuries to the head ward. The hospital's job is to patch them up quickly as best it can. Borden's hospital was essentially a MASH unit, and send them to hospitals further behind the lines. Thus, while men might remain at the hospital for a few days to die or begin recuperation before transport, for the most part, they spend such a short time at the hospital that the nursing staff does not learn their names or much else to humanize them. The question of why nurses participate in the war is a key issue in the Forbidden Zone. If soldiers' deaths cannot be described in terms of nobility or even utility, still less can the actions of the we who, like unthinking, unquestioning robots, repair broken men so they can be pointlessly killed. Thus, a story like Rosa, which deals with an attempted suicide brought to the hospital to be healed so he can be court-martialed and executed by firing squad, highlights the nurse narrator's inability to perform the kind of caring medical functions that presumably motivated her volunteer service. As the story begins, the first-person narrator reveals herself as naive and inexperienced when a soldier arrives at the hospital shot through the mouth, and she thinks, "Shot in the mouth? Through the roof of the mouth? He must have been asleep in the trench with his mouth open. You fool. You big hulking brute beast, going to sleep like that in utter careless weariness." The surgeon, by contrast, more experienced in the various forms of morbidity the war serves up, knows precisely what he is observing. He shot himself through the mouth. It's a suicide. He and the other medical personnel begin their mechanical acts to save the man's life, so that he can be shot, madame, for attempted suicide. But the narrator innocently cries out against the pointless cruelty. "You don't understand. You've made a mistake. He had a reason. Leave him alone with it. You can't bring him back now to be shot again." The contrast between the narrator's humane impulse to withhold medical care so that the soldier's plan to die can succeed, and the doctor's methodical and unquestioning performance of his medical duty, no matter how pointless and cruel, probes the question of how one can be caring and supportive in time of war. The nurse, shown as both more innocent and more humane than the doctor, she still believes she is there to do good for the soldiers, argues for a mode of caring in which empathy is privileged over medical duty. That ethic, of course, has been stifled by the time of conspiracy, the story I spoke of earlier, but Borden chooses here to demonstrate the difficulty of maintaining one's own internal morality in the maelstrom of the Great War. In the end, all the narrator can do is instruct her subordinate to leave the soldier's bandage off the next time he removes it. In the nurse's response, the narrator reminds readers of the moral problem at the center of the story. She was highly trained. Her traditions, her professional conscience, the honor of her calling loomed for a moment before her. Then her eyes lighted. The war offers only bad choices to its participants, whether soldier, nurse, or civilian. Failure to do one's duty turns out to be the kinder and more humane response to the injured soldier's plight. Santanu Das describes the problem of nurses like the one in Borden's story as the fundamental unshakability of the experience of the soldiers, and yet the juddering of the senses by serving the wounded body so intimately, and argues that it leads to a crisis of experiencing. Nursing, he writes, is a constant emptying of oneself before great need and greater pain, and yet somehow always falling short. In this way, nurses experience both great responsibility and inability to meet it, correlating their role with that of combatants like junior officers, who Pat Barker argues in Regeneration are feminized by their position of care and powerlessness in the front lines. Hazel Hutchinson notes that the narrator's decision to follow her conscience rather than her professional duty to heal provides key insight into Borden's probing of gender politics in the Forbidden Zone. The power of the female nurse over the passive patient demonstrates the failure of the conventional sexual hierarchy, she writes, especially as the nurse's defiance deliberately undercuts the male chain of command of Army regulations, which would have them restore the soldier's physical self at the expense of his emotional self, only to destroy him all over again. The requirement of war for soldiers to offer their bodies to the Army for disposal, as generals see fit, prevents those same soldiers from taking their lives into their own hands. As the doctor in Rosa says, "But, Madame, we have epidemics of suicide in the trenches. Panic seizes the men. Unless the penalty is what it is, to be court-martialed and shot, the thing would spread." The fundamental illogic of this, in order to prevent mass suicide, the Army requires mass executions, cannot be acknowledged by the male doctor, but only by the female nurse, who privileges her compassion and empathy over the rigid discipline of the military. At the same time, the soldier himself crosses boundaries of gender through his name. The nurse narrator calls him Rosa, because the soldier keeps muttering that name, which seems to be connected with whatever problem caused him to attempt suicide. But the soldier's passivity and struggle against life also mark him as something other than human. The narrator remarks his dark look of dumb subhuman suffering. The war, then, has utterly disrupted the usual grounds on which humans see and interact with one another. Compassion, the ostensible reason a woman like Mary Borden becomes a nurse, runs counter to the military mission, as of course it must. From the masculine point of view of the doctor, Rosa's fate is regrettable but reasonable. It is only the nurse's feminine compassion that can break through the military logic and allow the soldier to die as he wished. But Borden does not make a simplistic argument that feminine values are better than masculine ones. She posits the compassion of the nurse narrator in Rosa as a function of her naivete, in the same way that the narrator does not at first understand how the soldier came by his injury. She also believes that compassion and humanity have a place in this war. By the second half of the book, placed in the Somme battlefields, Borden pulls no punches about the relative merits of conventional understandings of gender. Neither masculine nor feminine values are suited to the front lines, because those values are fundamentally human, and the war itself is beyond human imagining or comprehension.